Welcome to this Sunday virtual class, sponsored by BYU Library Family History in Provo, Utah. Our class today will be What's New in Genealogy Programs and Apps, presented by James Tanner. He has spent many years researching and teaching in genealogy and family history, and we appreciate his many contributions to the field of family history. And we appreciate him preparing today's class and are very interested in hearing about this topic. So I'll turn the time now over to you, James.
We're going to talk about what's new and a little bit about all the different things that are going to happen. And obviously, the first thing that you want to talk about when you're going to talk about what's new in genealogy is artificial intelligence. And there's a couple of things important to understand about artificial intelligence. First of all, the name itself, artificial intelligence, is unfortunate. The reason it's unfortunate is because there's nothing artificial about it, and there's really no intelligence about it. It happens to be a computer program, a type of computer program. And if it were called a computer intelligence simulation program or something of that nature, it probably would never have caught on as being something that you talk about. And I see a constant stream of predictions that artificial intelligence will end civilization as we know it or do some other terrible things. And the answer is probably not, and probably not much of an impact, except in some very specific areas. And so as I go through and talk about the programs that have and things that have happened, part of what we'll see will be the impact that artificial intelligence, we'll use that term, has on genealogical research and upon the greater communities, because basically you'll see what happens with when we have these kinds of programs. But I think the first thing we need to do is understand what it is and how it is going to affect everything depends on what it really is. And what it really is, it's a theory and a development of computer systems that are able to perform tasks that normally require human intelligence. Let's say human intervention would probably be a better way to put that, such as visual perception, speech recognition, decision-making, and translation between languages. So some of the things that we've had for many, many years, like Google Translate, for example, and I'll talk a little bit about that, have been around for a long time, and they're not a threat. And the fact that you can use your phone using Google Translate to translate signs, and if you're traveling around in Europe and you don't know how to read the German, French, Spanish, Italian, whatever it is, you can simply pull out your smartphone, go to Google Translate, and use the Translate app on the phone to take a picture. It uses the camera to take a picture of the sign. You don't have to actually take the picture. You just point at the sign and it will give you the translation to that particular sign. And if you want to talk to somebody, you can dictate into the app and then play it back in German, French, Spanish, or whatever, Italian. So, those kinds of things have been around, and they've been around and developing, and no one goes, oh, this is going to create a great problem for everyone. No, what they're really talking about now is a secondary sort of development from artificial intelligence. There's two things that go into it. Number one is the huge web combing applications and programs such as Google, and the same thing for Microsoft, the same thing for a lot of other programs. What they do is they go out, and which Google's done for many, many years now, is go out and index everything in the many, many billions of websites out on the internet. So when you do a Google search, you're searching for an individual topic, Now all they've done, and what the latest thing with the chat programs is that the chat programs simply add another level of search in addition to finding what there is out there. The same thing that would happen with Google for the last few years. They've added the ability to take information from around the web and create some kind of a narrative about that information. And we'll talk about how that works out as I go along here. Now, one of the other things that's been around for a really long time, and it's been developing very more and more sophisticated all the time, is optical character recognition. Technically, this is all part of artificial intelligence, because character recognition is something that we do as human beings. And so now the computer is going to do that. And there are some very commonly used programs like Adobe Acrobat Pro, ABBY, Fine Reader, Wondershare PDF Element. That name's a little bit unfortunate too, because it looks like PDF Element, but it's actually PDF Element, and many others. There's just a lot of OCR out there. And it's a very convenient thing. For instance, I used it and use it frequently when I have a typed document that I don't want to keep paper. So I just do the OCR and get rid of the paper. And then I have a text file of what was on the piece of paper. That's assuming I don't want to keep the paper. So this is not something that's threatening. This is something that goes on every day, and it's part of this artificial intelligence. Now, one of the steps that's always been concern for genealogists over the years, for many years. I mean, the first thing that happens when you start to do genealogical research and you have no background, for example, in reading old documents, and that's not something that people just automatically have, is that you will encounter documents, even starting with the 1950 US Census and going back, that contain handwritten documents that, unless you know those documents, you can't read. And we now frequently run into, because of school systems throughout the United States, we run into people who have never been taught how to read or write cursive. And so it's just like reading a foreign language, somebody written in a script that you don't understand, like Cyrillic for Russian, or some of the other Eastern European scripts, or Arabic, or Hebrew, or the Indians from India scripts, and things like that. All of those different handwritings and all those different scripts pose a tremendous obstacle to doing family history, because, first of all, the handwriting could be marginally good or pretty bad, or terrible, or just undecipherable. You know, it can be undecipherable, just totally can't read this because it's just scribble. But basically, handwriting recognition is a basic skill that people have to learn over a long period of time with a lot of practice. And the fact that I can stare at this particular example and read 98% of it just without even thinking about it only comes because of the 40 plus years of me looking at these documents. Now, what if we could train a computer to read these documents? Well, here's the big obstacle we've had. This document, the information in these documents, is in a sense locked up. What does that mean? It means that even though we have optical character recognition and can scan and index a document like a newspaper or anything typewritten or printed material, reading this old script is very, very difficult. And it's been the last 10 or 12 years or so that I've been monitoring this and being semi-involved in the process. Part of the major research being done on it was being done in the genealogical standpoint. From a genealogical standpoint, a lot of people use it, like the US Post Office and other people. But the idea of using this to transcribe old records and index those old records was something that was kind of out there, something that people were trying to accomplish. So for the last 10 years or so, like I mentioned, I've been looking at watching people work on this. And it basically, once we got to that particular situation, the area was the Family History Technology Lab at Brigham Young University, or BYU. And so as time passed and as more and more information from around the world, there were lots and lots of different people eventually working on it. And they even had international conferences. This was the one that's being held in August in 2023 in San Jose, California, of the document analysis and recognition world. And every year they get together, they have competitions, they see what kinds of things could happen. Well, all of that came to fruition about 2.5 or 3 years ago, to the point where they were reading old German script at 98% accuracy. They were reading most documents at a higher level of accuracy than human indexers were able to do. Now, why is that? Well, because they take the information from hundreds of thousands of documents and like thousands of people's ability to do that. They have huge databases. And so they use the databases to create a program that will say, is it this, or is it this, or is it this, or is it this? And most of these documents are, except for the names, which are a little bit more of a challenge, but most of these documents, the text is the same all the time. So if you go to, for instance, Catholic parish records from the 1700s up to the 1900s, you'll find that the language is virtually the same. There's the vocabulary, the total vocabulary is extremely small. And you might be surprised to find out, for example, if you don't understand how this is possible, is that there are only 7,000 unique words in Hebrew in the Old Testament of the Bible. So in a lot of cases, it's not just this unending thing, because then once you know that this is a parish register, and you know that this is what it's going to say, and you've had thousands of people who have transcribed and just read those old scripts and have recorded the results, then you can just put all that information into a computer and say, okay, now here's a new one that no one's done. What does it say? And that's kind of a simplified way of looking at it, but that's what they've done. And so what we have now is what happened with Ancestry this past year. Ancestry applied handwriting recognition and artificial intelligence. You have to tack on artificial intelligence because people wouldn't know that handwriting recognition was part of artificial intelligence. And they created a searchable index of the 1950 census. When they did that, the 1940 census, when Ancestry did the processing of the 1940 census, with the aid of Family Search and other volunteers around the world, Ancestry took 6 months for them to come up with an index to the 1940 census. Well, the 1950 census is considerably larger. And the question here is, how long did it take them to do in the 1950 census? It took them 6 days to process the information, not 6 months. And since that time, and I'll show some more interesting things about that. So Ancestry isn't the only company doing this, and Family Search, through the BYU and other people who've been working on it, and the programmers for Family Search, basically have developed their own sophisticated system for handwriting recognition. And the record collections new searchable records will be added, but at the same time, new searchable records are being added to Family Search, which will make a huge impact on people using Family Search. Other websites are going to add lots of other records. But for records added, and when Family Search talks in terms of records being added, there's really two categories there, because they send out notices each week or each time period, usually about a week, of the records that have been added that week to various collections, or that month, or whenever the notice comes out constantly. But if you read between the lines, you'll understand that that's not the new records that have been digitized and added to the digital collections. These are the records that have been indexed and added to the index collections. So when they say record collection expansions, that means these are digitized records that are being added. And if you read what it says there, it says it then utilizes a combination of handwriting recognition, artificial intelligence, and online volunteers to make those records discoverable. So what are the online volunteers? The online volunteers are the ones that volunteer, and we'll say it's the same in the indexing, from the indexing situation. They're the ones that come in and correct the information being done by the handwriting recognition. Now, is there a correction? I've done pages and pages of these corrections during when the 1950 census was being done, and what I found was that the artificial intelligence handwriting recognition was about as good as it could get. In other words, most of the errors that I found were errors that we didn't even have the words properly, or the words weren't even readable by any means. So for me, that clinched the fact that I understood that records were being added. One of the things that was touted at RootsTech was that artificial intelligence is taking over our story composition. In other words, programs out there that take your information that you put it in and put it into a story context and turn it into something that sounds like a narrative, or sounds like you wrote something that was well done or grammatical or whatever. And depending on the programs that were out there, there were a number of programs presented at RootsTech about it. The question was, who was going to use the program and why would we use it? So there was a lot of discussion, and basically what it was a takeoff of the chat programs that we now are hearing a lot about online. And so those chat programs, the primary one of these that came out, it's Chat GPT, which has now been incorporated by Microsoft. So now we have a lot of information, and this is what kind of stuff was being thrown around at the tech forum at RootsTech, and that was terms like augmented reality, artificial intelligence, the cloud, blockchains, social media, 5G, all of these different buzzword things out there that if you understand what's going on in the background, these are the things that are affecting how genealogy will be done. Okay, so let me just kind of give you an idea of the contrast. So 40 years ago or plus, when I began doing research, it was entirely paper-based, just totally paper-based. And so now I would say it's 98% off of paper. So I don't do hardly anything on paper anymore. So I've gone a huge thing. And if you were relying on me to buy paper to use, you would go broke, because I wouldn't be buying much paper anymore. I mean, a package of printer paper for me lasts like a year or two now. So there's really nothing that unless we're actually required to provide some kind of paper to someone, that we actually print anymore. And that's a big change. That's a big way of doing things. But it also means that all of the information which was static and sitting on paper documents at the time I started is now accessible online, accessible, the images, the records, the documents, the information. It can be edited, it can be changed, it can be all of that. It becomes a fluid thing. It's not necessarily a piece of paper that you can't do anything with unless you take out white it out or whatever. But here using what we use now, we're totally kind of divorced from that. We've moved to something entirely different. And it's all based on the technology which comes through the internet, through the programs on the internet, and through the way that we handle the documents and the information as we go back and forth. So the changes and the impacts have been coming on now for 100 years. And it's just been something that's been out there for 100 years. It was over 100 years ago that the first computer programs were essentially where computer programs were developed. And it's been now, many years since anything that I've done, that I've become involved. Now, another part of it is of an artificial intelligence is the speech recognition. So now we have voices to talk to. And so I can say something like, hey, Siri, give me directions to Costco or to Walmart or to one of the stores. And Siri will come on and say, I found a store at such and such location. Is this the one you want to go to? And I'll say yes, and then they'll start giving me directions. Well, all of that is part of what we call artificial intelligence. And no one's, we're not, well, maybe there are a few people who think Siri is going to take over the world, or maybe Alexa is going to beat out Siri or whatever. But on the other hand, we have a tremendous amount of interactive, and that's what creates this interactive. You can ask questions and have somebody answer that question, and that's been going on now for quite a few years, and it gets more and more sophisticated all the time. Well, the sophistication level of that artificial intelligence interaction just reached sort of a critical mass. And what that did was it said, we've adopted such a huge amount of information, and we've created programs that are so sophisticated that you'd be able to actually carry on conversations and talk to it. Well, okay, so that was, we talked to the computer. Well, okay, back 30 plus years, there was a program called ELIZA, and it was made up to be like a sociologist or psychologist interaction. So it would say, well, how are you feeling today? And it would go on. You couldn't talk to it, but you would type in this information to the program, and it would carry on a conversation. But if you ask it something like, where are you? Then it couldn't respond. And the same thing with these. There are some questions with ChatGPT that just create nonsense. And as I'm going to show and explain a little bit about, most of what you ask these programs about genealogy is basically comes out as just nonsense. It doesn't even bear any relationship to what you would call research. Okay, so there's another part of this that is doable, and it involves handwriting recognition and optical character recognition, and it also involves the indexing part. But then there's another step that's been taken, and that's called CGT, or computer generated trees. And this is there's a news article down there that I've referenced, and basically what it does is it creates trees built in specific locations around the world with richly indexed historical records from AI indexing. So once the AI indexing has created this mass of data about a certain kind of document, say parish registers from a state in Mexico, and they've gone through the state parish registers, millions of records, extracted all the names and all the information about all the people, and everything is basically understood there because in the documents themselves, it'll say this baby was baptized and these are the parents. The father was so-and-so, the mother was so-and-so. It'll say the witnesses was the grandmother and the grandfather. This is the kinds of things that the information that's in those records. And so by taking that information, they're able to create what we would call a pedigree, a family tree of, and then they use AI tools. So they add additional information. And as it turns out to be very sophisticated information at the level of trying to avoid the usual things that genealogists have to look for duplicates, for attaching the wrong child to a family, and all the different types of things that you would be concerned about. And then they put them into family trees. And then they build it so that it looks like a pedigree file. And so when you look at this, at the production of this computer-generated trees, they're actually a pedigree, maybe 2, 3, 4 generations, or sometimes more, depending on the amount of information that's available in the total records. And so this is where the question comes up earlier on, is that will artificial intelligence do all our genealogy for us? And the answer is a definite no, because all of the information that went into these trees still has to be reviewed and evaluated, just like any other information. It's like an index. An index is only as good as the indexing, and indexes cannot contain all the information, or they might be lacking in information. In other words, there's a constant play between the technology and the information that we have, that we gained ourselves, or the experience and the understanding and the learning that we gain ourselves as we start to do genealogy that interact. And they're just like tools. I mean, would you think you would want to build your, to build a house like the house around the country today and in most of the world with limited tools? Well, the more tools they have and the more resources they have, then the society can build more sophisticated housing. And that's the same way with genealogy and research. The more tools we have, the more understanding we have of how all this works together, and the more sophisticated the indexing programs are, will simply help us to accelerate the work, number one. It will also help us to find more, let's call it contradicting information very quickly. And so it's something that you're still going to be looking at, and we're not going to be out of business for, I would be very surprised if it would get to this level of very much difficulty. Now, where would it change that? Where would I going to qualify what I just said? The qualifying factor is that during the past 75 years, there was a dramatic increase in printed information as opposed to handwritten information around the world. And so when was the last time you received a handwritten letter from somebody? Probably a note on a card or a short note on a record. But technically, almost everything I receive today is either on an email or some other situation. So basically, what we're looking for is to the point where the information becomes easier to access. And that's what's happened the last 50 years or so. And as it's gotten easier to access that information, it has put it into a situation that today, using the 1950 census and other things like that and other tools, technically we could build that. Now, was that a new thing? Is that something that we should be surprised that's going to happen in the future and it's going to put us all out of work? Well, I don't think that if you've watched, as I have, maybe dozens, maybe into the hundreds of people sign on for the first time on MyHeritage, then you will probably begin to understand that this is helpful and not a threat and not something that's going to put anybody out of business. Because when you sign on to MyHeritage the first time, they ask you for some basic information. If you're here from the United States or a lot of other countries, then as you enter that information, which is your information about where you were born and when and where you were born, when and where your parents were born, and when and where, if you know it, where your grandparents were born. And within a matter of a few seconds, MyHeritage will almost uniformly create a tree with 50 or plus relatives for you. And that's been going on now for years. And no one seems to feel totally threatened by that. And the reaction of most of the people I have seen has just been absolute amazement and delight. And a lot of people that I've done it with have burst into tears because they had no idea that they even had relatives. And so this kind of information is not challenging. It's really a benefit to all of the way that and from what I've seen, it's certainly a benefit to me. I'm able to create much more information than I did. So now the complex connections are done in a matter of hours rather than thousands of hours of manual labor. And if you go back in history, all of these so-called labor-saving jumps in technology have created cultural problems, cultural opposition. Going back to the Luddites in the early 1817 and late 1700s and early 1800s, who went around smashing the machines in England and other places because the weavers were all going to go out. So these mechanical looms were a threat and that they weren't going to all lose their work. Well, that was one of the changes. And this is a similar change. So there's going to be repercussions. Things will change. The way I do the work today is substantially different. It's unrecognizably different than what I started with years ago. Okay, so here's where it is. I'm not talking, when I talk about computer generated trees, I am not talking about something that's just out there. This is right here on the familysearch.org website. If you go to the search tab and click down, you'll see an entry for genealogies. And I would think that probably the vast majority of the people who are using Family Search have never clicked on that, or they've clicked on it once or twice and didn't have any idea what it was, so they didn't look at it. But here is where the computer-generated trees, or the CGT trees, are located. And so when you look at a CGT tree, there are only a few examples of it right now. And you can see the numbers of records, or the people that were extracted and put into these records. I have no idea how many more, or what Family Search intends to do with this in the future. But this was a demonstration that it could be done. Now, they may be into a long discussion about whether they want to do it or whether they think it's has some value. But in other words, this is something that could and has been done and is now online. And if you go to that one, for instance, I use the example of the Mexico records from Nuevo León, the state of Mexico. And this is a generated tree. There's people identified in the family tree from this particular family tree, and these are all people all appear. Now, the question is, are they already in the family tree? And if I found that there was no way to click on one of these people and go directly to the tree. But when I put in the number, then at least the very first one showed up. So I think part of the discussion is whether they want to add these people to the Family Search family tree automatically, or whether they want to just leave them in this computer-generated trees situation. Okay, so I mentioned this a while ago, and this is the tool that began that's part of this whole process of making the genealogy become usable and doable. And that is something that I use almost constantly, and that is Google Translate. And I do research in a variety of different languages for people all the time. And it's very simple to sit there with Google and copy in or paste in if you have text, you have files online, or transcribe if you have something, and get translations of documents and headings and all sorts of information. So rather than sitting down and spending a great deal of time trying to learn how to read a parish register in Italian, for example, then you simply can translate all the headings, and then you know exactly what everything is. And if there's any other language, you translate it, and then you have it ready to go. It only takes a matter of a few minutes to go through this. And the process here of the online and mobile versions is exactly what I was saying. If you hold that sign up to your phone like that, then it's translated, the actual image of the sign is translated into English or whatever language you want it to be translated into. So these are the kinds of things that are out there. So as you're working and you're getting into, one of the biggest hurdles, obviously, as you go back in time, is finding someone who speaks a language in your ancestry who spoke a language different than yours, and then you're kind of required to learn a certain amount of information. Well, all that information is readily available now because you can translate practically anything with Google Translate. And you can use the picture here thing to look at a document on the screen, and it will, in some cases, when it's clear enough, it sometimes has to do with the resolution, it will translate it right there in your hand. So it's kind of an interesting way to look at the information that's out there. So here it is. So if you wanted to translate from Dutch to English, then you would simply put in the Dutch. But here's all of the different languages that are translated by Google Translate presently. Now, some of the genealogy websites have started using the same kind of language translation technology for some of their records and some of the things that they do, like, for example, MyHeritage, that will translate names into 42 different languages, and Family Search that's also begun the process of using and implementing different language structures. Now, one of the things that's caught everybody's attention is the advent of this photography and image manipulation. One of the things that's been a great help over the years is being able to use the computers to look at old images, for instance, old photographs, and in a sense, if they're negatives, to develop them and turn them into black and white prints, and if they're too blurry or something to recognize or to do, or they're torn or they're ruined or whatever, then all of these tools that have been developed for photographers have become very useful for genealogists. And so there's been a fairly good use for those. And one of the most dramatic implementations of all of these visual photographic tools has come from MyHeritage. There's a photo of my grandparents at their wedding day. And this is what I could produce now in a matter of a few seconds with uploading that picture and using it on MyHeritage. So beyond clarifying it, and it can colorize and dramatically fix, which I've done in the last week or so, fixed a photograph that was torn and folded and really looked rotten, and was completely fixed by MyHeritage's technology. Now, MyHeritage doesn't have the lock on this because it's the same technology is being implemented by Adobe for Photoshop and being implemented by dozens of other programs that are now being advertised heavily. But that's where we benefit. Now, one of the side notes from once again MyHeritage was the ability to take photographs of you individually, or anyone else, actually, if you had enough photographs of a person, and do some characterization of those, turn them into characters from different times in history. So here's a little video of how MyHeritage took those pictures and turned them into various characters across history. So what they would look like. And so it's called the AI Time Machine. That was it went viral, and there's been tens of millions of those photos generated across the internet. One of the areas that we are benefiting greatly from artificial intelligence and genealogy are the advances in DNA testing and analysis. And it's a matter here that DNA is a matter of sheer numbers. The number of chromosomes, the number of discrete genetic units that we have to deal with, and putting that into all of the huge masses of people so that we can come up with some organization. And that's what artificial intelligence has been accomplishing over the years. And so now we have some very sophisticated programs, and they can tell us, as this one, for example, gives a DNA match with 49.9% accuracy. Well, since a person receives 50% of their DNA from their their father, and 50% from their mother, then anything close to 50% means that person's a lot more related. And so the shared DNA, if I share 49.9% with someone, it's probable that that person, the probability is 100% that this person is my daughter. So that's the kind of information that has an ever expanding impact, because previously there were two categories of people in genealogy who were essentially dead ends, end of lines, brick walls, whatever you want to call those people. And they were foundlings who were left on the doorstep with no identification, and adopted people who lived in a situation where in the last 100 or so years that some of the countries have limited information on available to adoptees about their birth families. And so it was a very expensive and a very difficult process. Today, if you get on to either Ancestry or MyHeritage and take a DNA test, and you're an adopted or a foundling, the chances are, because of the great size of both of those databases, is that you will find relatives. And as you find relatives, you will obviously be able to do some research that in many, many cases ends up with identification of your bloodline parents. So this is when you talk about artificial intelligence and you start thinking it's basically a situation where it's negative because of everything's being said about it being a threat to this and a threat to that, and the whole world is going to disappear. No, it's simply another step, and it will be accommodated and incorporated, and some people will change their jobs and other people will benefit from it. And genealogists are always, in all of these areas that I've talked about so far, will benefit from the developments in artificial intelligence. And this is another program that was done by MyHeritage. It's called the Centimorgan Explainer, and that CM is the abbreviation for centimorgans, which is the measurement of the relationship, the percentage relationship. And what MyHeritage decided to do was to make this much more accurate, down to the 10th of a centimeter, centimorgan, and to also add in plain language descriptions of who these people were, and get rid of all the fourth generation removed and things like 17th a seventh cousin 5 generations removed and all those kinds of language and jargon things. And so basically they have created a family tree that just in plain language tells you how people are related, and then can be used to show the percentage or average percentage of relationship in each of those different categories. And this may not be perfectly right, because it could be the percentages can change by a variation of quite a bit. But this is something that you can then use as a tool, because by putting in information, taking the DNA test, taking the information that you get from your DNA test, and entering the centimorgan values into a field, then MyHeritage will generate something like this that shows you how you could be related to that person and who the remote ancestor would be. So I mentioned that fact that MyHeritage was translating names into 42 different languages. But what they've expanded that also to translating all the names for your DNA matches. So the answer here is that there's an interplay between the handwriting recognition, optical character recognition, and all these other tools that are being created that will give you the names, rather than being basically looking at someone that has a name in that in another script that you don't read, then it will translate that name into whatever language you want, from English on to their 42 different languages. So this enables you to be able to go through and see, without spending so great amount of time trying to translate each name individually and then not knowing what that would be, the equivalent would be in English. Now, Ancestry does the similar thing. Ancestry has their through lines, and the through lines will show you, and this basically, this new technology from both Ancestry and MyHeritage will confirm, in a sense, scientifically confirm some of your own research. So as they go through and list all of your great-great-grandparents, fifth generation, in this case, back 5 generations, all the people that are listed here have been confirmed by Ancestry to be related to me by DNA, and are related to me because of the research that's been done on the website. So in the question of whether or not any of these people are not my relatives, in other words, that someone's put in someone here that is not related to me, that question's now been resolved. Even though we have a tremendous amount of research on some of these people, it's nice to know that along with that, we have genetic data that shows that I am genetically related to these people. So between the two, then it will take the DNA matches and this particular very sophisticated artificial intelligence type program and help to confirm basically 40 or so years of actually from all my relatives combined, about over 100 years worth of research, which is comforting. Now, there's another thing. What has been difficult before, and rather not just rather difficult, but extremely challenging, was what we call cross-language record matches. And what a cross-record matches is that if you have someone here in English, it will go find that same name in Greek, in the Greek alphabet. So we have recognition program going, or Cyrillic, or whichever language that it is, and recognize that name in the record. So you're getting record matches from MyHeritage, for example, that will say this is the person that's related to you, or suggest that that's a record match that could be related to you in this language. And then, of course, it's up to you to evaluate and figure out if that's correct. But with the sophistication of the technology, it's very likely that that information will be helpful, the same way that all record matches seem to be helpful now that we are getting that kind of record matching technology, which is also basically based on internet and artificial intelligence. Okay, so looking directly at GPT, at Chat GPT, if it's kind of an it's OpenAI is the company. And basically you can register for this and get invited to be in the program. And you can put information in here. And then it will put out a bunch of text answering questions. The kinds of questions, for example, describe how to do an oral interview, and it will give you all the steps for doing an oral interview. So what does it do? What doesn't it do? Well, I'll tell you what it doesn't do. It doesn't do genealogical research. So don't start putting in who was my great-great-grandfather, because the responses that you'll get out of that are going to be just simply a bunch of words that are just imaginary stuff. And it's now been incorporated into the mainline programs like Microsoft and Google, and Microsoft has incorporated that into a program where you can create, do the text creation and also create images. And why this helps me is I spend a tremendous amount of time looking for public domain images that I can use without interfering with somebody's copyrights. And by having those images, believe me, it takes a lot of time to come up with something. So I have an idea and I need an image that shows that idea. And then I have to go out and search for hours to find that image online. But now what I can do is just describe what I want, a program like this, like Microsoft's image creator, and it will create an image. And I'm using a considerable number of those in my research. For example, I put a book floating in the air with a library behind it. And here's the image that came from floating in the air with a library behind it. And this becomes just part of a narrative on a PowerPoint, on a presentation, or on a video. And so this, and the fact that I can get this and that it's absolutely not copyright protected because it's an original work. And the question is, will it interfere on someone else's picture that they may have created? Well, that's the kind of thing that's going to be coming down and that's being used. But in this kind of instance, first of all, I can't imagine anybody who would have created exactly this image and then decided that they wanted to defend a copyright on it. But beyond that, there's where you get into trouble is where you try to copy somebody's paintings and where you try to copy their photographs directly. And there's a big lawsuit that just came down from the United States Supreme Court on that. Involved Andy Warhol and a photograph by a professional photographer. So there's no limits to the technology or to your imagination, and there's really no limits to the benefits and effect that this will have on doing research in the future and being able to convey information and do presentations and videos. And so I think that any changes are overrepresented, but I have a comment here. I have specifically entered information on multiple occasions over the past time that this has been coming out as a big deal to GPT, Chat GPT, and Bing and Bard, and asking genealogical research questions. And it's a total bust. They're all totally inadequate and so far produce no usable information at all. I can ask for information about my great-grandfather who has thousands of records online, all of which are accurate in depth. and it comes up with stuff that doesn't even relate to him at all. Had him married to 2 different women with last names that I never heard of, all sorts of things. In other words, in its ability, it has ability that is basically search engine limited, and you get 5 things that are correct when you do a search, and you get 2 million things that you don't want to look at. Well, you've got to do the same thing when you start getting into these chat programs. There may be a couple of things in there that are helpful, but the rest of it can be pure garbage. So I just would say that you don't want to put yourself in a train wreck and start thinking that these programs are going to be able to do genealogy from this chat angle. Now, what's the difference between these chat and the computer-generated tree? They're working off of records, and at the end of the product, they give you the link to the record, so you know which records these came from. And because you know where this came from, you can go through and verify the information. The chat TP, Bing right now and Google are starting to give you some footnotes that tell you where the information came from. So over time, perhaps, they will actually produce some information that's helpful. But right now, that's part of the problem, is that they're worried about the fact that it can create so much false information in such a short period of time. Okay. And as I've been saying all along, I find artificial intelligence tools that have come along over the past few years to be things that help, such as the images like this one that I've got here on this slide, that are perfectly usable for the purposes that I want to use them for. And so I see it as another great time saver. And I think the effect will be that I'll be able to put out even more presentations, even faster than I could before. And I don't know if that's a great benefit in the world, but anyway, there'll be a lot more information coming out. Okay, well, thanks for watching.